At 10:43 in a deadly snowstorm, a German shepherd knocked on a former Navy SEAL's door. Around the dog's neck were 8 photographs and a 9th chair bearing Mason Reed's name. The dog led Mason to an abandoned railway station where a 50-year-old secret was still waiting underground. Inside, Mason found the friend his silence had destroyed. Then a hidden safe opened. Black water began to rise, and the truth threatened to die with them. Mason had spent years leaving before the hardest conversations began. This time, would he stay? Where are you watching from? If this story touches your heart, please click the like button and subscribe to help us reach 1,000 subscribers. At 10:43 p.m., with the blizzard swallowing every road out of Brightwater Ridge, something knocked on Mason Reed's front door. It was not the flat, frightened pounding of a stranded traveler. One strike came first, low against the wood. Then 2 close together. Then a final blow after a pause long enough to feel deliberate. Mason lifted his head from the kitchen table. The cabin's iron stove breathed softly behind him, throwing amber light across the green camouflage shirt fitted over his broad shoulders. Its sleeves were rolled to just below his elbows, as they almost always were, exposing weathered forearms marked by pale scars. Matching tactical cargo pants and dark brown military boots completed the practical uniform of a man who had stopped serving years ago without ever learning how to dress, as though danger had truly ended. At 48, Mason stood a little over 6 feet tall, solidly built from outdoor labor rather than vanity. His tanned, square face held strong lines around a firm jaw. Short, dark brown hair, touched with gray and silver at both temples, rose naturally at the top. A thick salt and pepper stubble covered his chin and jaw, and his light gray eyes had the quiet sharpness of a man who entered every room by first locating its exits. The knock came again. 1. 2 close together. 1. Mason crossed the cabin without reaching for the rifle above the stone hearth. His hand knew where it was. That was enough. When he opened the door, the storm tried to enter before the animal did. Snow drove sideways through the porch light, whitening the pine steps and the dark forest beyond them. A large German shepherd stood in the center of it, his black and tan coat crusted with ice, his chest broad, his body lean but powerful beneath the winter fur. He was an older working dog, perhaps 8, with silver beginning around his muzzle and deep amber eyes that were neither pleading nor confused. A small V-shaped scar marked the outer edge of his right ear. A thinner scar crossed his right front leg. He wore no coat, only an old dark brown leather collar and a waterproof canvas pouch strapped beneath it. The metal tag read, Harlan. The dog did not rush toward the warmth. He looked at Mason, then passed him into the cabin, assessing the room with disciplined patience. "You found the right house?" Mason said, though he had no reason to believe it. Harlan's ears shifted forward. Mason stepped aside. Only then did the shepherd cross the threshold, not like a lost animal accepting rescue, but like a messenger completing the first part of an assignment. Meltwater darkened the floorboards beneath his paws. He did not shake himself. He did not sniff the stove or the tin of dried meat on the counter. Instead, he turned and watched the door until Mason closed it against the storm. The pouch beneath Harlan's collar was cold enough to numb Mason's fingers. Inside were 8 Polaroid photographs, a leather-bound book, a single wooden match, and a folded piece of cream-colored paper. The book contained no title, and, when Mason opened it, no writing. Every page appeared blank. The paper carried one sentence in a narrow, deliberate hand. "Do not bring us back before the 9th chair is occupied." Mason spread the photographs across the kitchen table. Each showed an elderly person sitting alone at the same long wooden table in a dark room. Behind them, stood a window filmed with frost. Before each person rested an unlit candle, a sealed envelope, and an empty chair. Mason recognized several faces from Brightwater. Abigail Mercer appeared in the first photograph, a small 79-year-old former librarian, with white hair cut neatly to her chin, wire-framed glasses, and pale blue eyes that made people feel studied rather than merely observed. Her green wool coat was buttoned to the throat, and the burgundy scarf she wore made her look less fragile than ceremonial, like a woman who had dressed for judgment rather than winter. Dr. Samuel Keene occupied another image, thin and slightly stooped at 81, with white hair, tortoiseshell glasses, and the tired expression of a physician who had spent a lifetime reading bad news before giving it to others. Nora Bell, the quick-witted widow who had once run the post office, sat with her chin raised and one hand covering an envelope. Esther Wynne, the retired music teacher, appeared almost peaceful, her silver hair gathered low behind her head and a small musical note brooch pinned to her plum-colored coat. Owen Briggs, the old railroad supervisor, sat with his large, scarred hands flat on the table, as if waiting to confess something they had done. 3 other elderly residents appeared in the remaining photographs, people Mason knew by sight, but not well enough to know their stories. On the back of the pictures, times had been written in black ink: 11:10, 11:15, 11:20, 11:25, 11:30, 11:35, 11:40, 11:50. The final photograph was different. The table was empty. A 9th chair stood in its center position. A white card had been tied to the chair back. Mason Reed, 12:01 a.m. Harlan approached without a sound. He lowered his head over the photograph, breathed once across the glossy surface, and pressed the tip of his nose against the empty chair. Then he looked toward Mason's radio. The old emergency unit sat on the counter beside the window, its green light blinking through bursts of static. Mason lifted the handset and called the Brightwater Rescue Channel. It took 3 attempts before a dispatcher answered through the interference. 8 senior residents had disappeared from the Brightwater Community Center less than an hour earlier. Their vehicles remained in the parking lot. There had been no sign of a struggle. The security cameras had gone dark for exactly 7 minutes. During that gap, a retired railroad maintenance truck had been seen leaving through the rear service lane before the snow thickened enough to erase the tracks. Names? Mason asked, although he already knew 5 of them. The dispatcher read the list: Abigail Mercer, Samuel Keene, Nora Bell, Esther Wynne, Owen Briggs, then the other 3 people from the photographs. Mason looked at Harlan. You came from them. The shepherd held his gaze, but his right ear turned toward the dark window. The radio crackled again. Reverend Silas Gray had been notified and was responding with a medic. The name brought no immediate suspicion. In Brightwater, Silas was the man people called when pipes froze, when furnaces failed, when a veteran stopped answering his telephone, or an elderly widow needed groceries carried through snow. He had buried half the town and fed the other half. Mason had never trusted easy goodness, but Silas's kindness had never seemed easy. It had cost him time, money, sleep, and the quiet comfort most people protected as fiercely as property. Harlan suddenly took the final photograph between his teeth. He carried it to the front window and placed it on the floor beneath the glass. Beyond the pane, nothing moved except snow twisting through the porch light. The shepherd stared into the woods, body rigid, tail lowered. For several seconds, Mason heard only the storm and the quiet ticking of the stove. Then Harlan struck the floor once with his right paw. A branch broke somewhere beyond the cabin. Mason's hand moved toward the rifle before headlights emerged through the trees. The vehicle stopped beside his truck. Reverend Silas Gray entered first, brushing snow from a long charcoal overcoat. At 64, he was a slim, upright man with neatly combed silver hair, a clean-shaven, gentle face, and gray-brown eyes that usually met suffering without flinching. A narrow white clerical collar showed above his black shirt, and a small silver cross rested against his chest. The burn scar across his left hand was the only rough thing about him. Behind him came Luke Brennan, a 34-year-old emergency medical technician with a compact build, a wind-reddened face, and sandy hair flattened beneath a wool cap. Luke was steady, practical, and young enough to still believe every crisis had a procedure if one could only reach the proper page. Silas saw Harlan and stopped. "Thank God," he whispered. The dog watched him but did not approach. "You know him," Mason said. "I helped train him." Silas removed his gloves slowly. "He was part of our medical support program. Abigail suffered a cardiac episode 8 years ago while alone in her house. Harlan went to live with her after that. He can detect changes in pulse, breathing, panic responses. He has kept her alive more than once." Silas crouched several feet away and spoke the dog's name. Harlan's ears moved, but his body remained still. Mason placed the photographs on the table. Silas studied them one by one. His expression tightened when he saw the railroad room, though the change lasted only a moment. "Abigail has been thinking about the tunnel again," he said. "What tunnel?" "The old Brightwater rail tunnel. The accident happened there nearly 50 years ago. 7 people died." Silas looked down at Abigail's photograph. "Lately, she has become convinced the official account was incomplete. I thought grief had simply found a new door into the room." "You think she took 7 elderly people into an abandoned tunnel during a blizzard?" "I think Abigail can make dangerous things sound like moral obligations." It wasn't an answer. It was the kind of sentence that seemed honest while leaving its most important piece untouched. Silas reached for the blank leather book. Harlan struck the floor 3 times with his right paw. Mason caught Silas's wrist before the man touched the cover. Luke immediately glanced between them. "Easy," Silas said, but his face had lost color. His left hand rose to the center of his chest. Luke guided him into a chair, checked his pulse, and asked him to breathe slowly. The rhythm settled after several seconds. "Harlan wasn't accusing you," Mason said. Silas looked at the shepherd. "No. He was warning you. My heart had decided to contribute to the conversation." Luke gave Mason a brief nod. "Irregular rhythm from stress, not a heart attack." The discovery should have simplified things. Instead, it disturbed Mason. A man's body could reveal fear without explaining it. Harlan could detect the fear, but not its cause. Mason had once believed facts were cleaner than motives. 14 years earlier, he had signed his name beneath a factual statement about Caleb Ross and allowed that small, accurate truth to bury a larger one he had never bothered to ask for. Harlan moved to the stove and looked back at the blank book. The single wooden match lay beside it. Mason understood. He held the first page close to the heat, careful not to let the leather catch. Slowly, brown letters rose through the paper as if the words had been waiting beneath the surface for the right kind of fire. "The kindest man in Brightwater has lived for nearly 50 years inside a lie." Luke stopped breathing for a moment. Silas did not deny it. His eyes closed, and the pastor who had spoken at funerals, organized rescues, and told grieving families that truth and mercy could inhabit the same room suddenly looked older than 64. "She came to see me this afternoon," he said. "Abigail." Silas nodded. "She wanted me at the old dispatch room before midnight. She told me to bring a confession, and you refused." "I told her grief does not become justice simply because it survives a long time." "What did she want you to confess?" Silas looked toward Harlan, perhaps hoping the dog would provide another warning before he answered. The radio came alive. Static burst through the cabin, followed by a woman's strained voice. "Silas, if you are standing with Mason, tell him who was still alive when your father ordered the tunnel closed." Mason recognized Abigail from town meetings and library fundraisers. Even through the interference, her voice carried the same controlled precision. It did not sound confused. It sounded cold, breathless, and afraid of running out of time. Silas seized the handset. "Abigail, where are you?" Only static answered. Mason was already gathering the photographs and the blank book. Action came easily. Pack light. Read the terrain. Move before weather sealed the route. It was what he had been trained to do, and what he still trusted in himself. He would find the missing people. He would bring them home. He would not judge Silas, Abigail, or anyone else until they were safe. The promise sounded honorable. It was also familiar. 14 years earlier, Mason had told himself he would deal with Caleb after the inquiry ended, after the unit stabilized, after the facts were clear. By then, Caleb had lost his career, left the base, and learned exactly how much a friend's silence could weigh. Mason buttoned the waterproof pouch beneath Harlan's collar and reached for the door. Silas remained seated. "Abigail does not know the entire truth," he said. "If she opens the safe in that tunnel before she understands what actually happened, the first person destroyed will not be me." Mason turned. "Who will it be?" Silas looked at the photograph of the 9th chair. "The man she still believes died innocent." For the first time since entering the cabin, Harlan walked to the door without looking back. He faced the white forest, lifted his right paw and struck the floor twice. Then he waited for Mason to follow. Harlan was already in the passenger seat when Mason started the truck. The German Shepherd sat upright, his wet black and tan coat steaming faintly in the warm air, amber eyes fixed beyond the windshield, as though the mountain had spoken and he alone had understood. Silas Gray rode behind Mason with one gloved hand resting near his chest, the irregular rhythm that Harlan had detected, still leaving a trace of gray beneath the pastor's eyes. Luke Brennan sat beside him, holding the medical case between his knees. Snow hammered the cab roof and erased the road almost as quickly as the headlights found it. Brightwater Ridge had disappeared beneath a moving wall of white. Only the red-tipped reflector posts along the shoulder showed Mason where the mountain ended and open air began. He drove with both hands steady on the wheel. His rolled camouflage sleeves exposed his forearms to the cold, leaking through the cab, but he seemed not to notice. Men like Mason learned early that discomfort was information, not an excuse. Silas leaned forward. "The old station road will be worse past the church turn." "You've been there recently?" Mason asked. Silas hesitated. "Not inside." The answer was clean enough to survive inspection and incomplete enough to remain suspicious. Mason glanced at him in the mirror, then returned his attention to the road. He had spent too many years studying men at checkpoints not to recognize the difference between fear and guilt. The problem was that both could wear the same face. Harlan suddenly rose. His ears drove forward. A low vibration moved through his chest, not quite a growl. He planted both front paws against the dashboard. Mason braked. The truck stopped hard enough to throw Luke against his seatbelt. A second later, a pine tree snapped somewhere in the dark and crashed across the road 20 feet ahead. Snow exploded from its branches, filling the headlights with white dust. Luke stared at Harlan. "He heard that before we did." "He felt it," Mason said. The shepherd remained rigid until the tree settled. Only then did he sit again. There was nothing supernatural in it. A dog trained to detect the smallest changes in breath and pulse could also sense tremors through a truck floor, hear wood splitting beneath wind long before human ears separated it from the storm. But logic did not make the moment less unsettling. Sometimes God sent warnings through thunder. Sometimes through the steady paw of an old dog who refused to let men walk blindly into danger. Mason reversed, found an old logging spur, and circled around the fallen pine. By the time the abandoned Brightwater station appeared through the trees, the clock on the dashboard read 11:06. The building stood at the foot of the mountain, like something forgotten by time and forgiven by no one. Its steep roof sagged under snow. Frost blinded the ticket windows. The rusted rail sign still carried the faded word Brightwater, though the last two letters hung loose and struck the wall with every gust. A man waited beneath the platform awning. Caleb Ross was 52, a few inches shorter than Mason, but still broad through the shoulders, though years of pain had drawn the rest of him lean. His long face had sharp cheekbones and deep-set brown eyes that looked tired without ever becoming weak. Black hair, cut close, had gone heavily silver at the temples. A thin layer of gray evening stubble shadowed his jaw. A scar disappeared from behind his left ear beneath the collar of a dark Navy field medical jacket. Under it, he wore a charcoal sweater, black cargo pants, and black winter boots with worn, reliable soles. An old dark red medical bag hung from one hand. A portable oxygen cylinder rested beside him, along with a metal box marked for cardiac medication. When he stepped toward the truck, his right leg carried a slight hitch, the lasting result of an injury he had never learned to discuss without changing the subject. Mason climbed out. Neither man offered a hand. Caleb looked at the camouflage clothing, the military boots, the face Mason wore when preparing to enter a dangerous place. "This time, you got here before somebody left on a stretcher," he said. "That's progress." 14 years compressed into the space between them. Mason had imagined this meeting many times. In some versions, Caleb struck him. In others, Caleb forgave him before Mason had earned it. He had never imagined snow gathering on both their shoulders while an old station watched like a witness. "Where is Abigail?" Mason asked. "I don't know exactly." Harlan jumped down from the truck, walked directly to Caleb, and tapped his right paw against the platform 3 times. Silas stiffened. Mason watched Caleb's hands, his breathing, the angle of his shoulders. Caleb looked down at the dog. "He isn't calling me a liar. He's telling you my pulse went up because I still haven't decided whether to hit you." Luke lowered his face, unsuccessfully hiding the beginning of a smile. Mason did not smile. "Did Abigail send for you?" Caleb reached into his jacket and produced an envelope. His name had been typed across the front. Inside was one line: "Bring oxygen, cardiac medication, and your conscience. Be at the station before 11. "I arrived 12 minutes ago," Caleb said. The door was unlocked. No one answered. Silas looked at the medical supplies. "You knew they might be going underground." "I knew Abigail planned a private meeting. 1 hour, no reporters, no town council, no grandstanding. 8 older people reading letters and deciding whether they had enough to take to law enforcement." "You helped her," Mason said. "I kept her from taking 8 people with heart conditions and bad knees into a tunnel without oxygen. You should have stopped them." Caleb's expression changed, not loudly. The anger in him became quieter, which made it sharper. "You still think protecting people means deciding for them." The station seemed to contract around the sentence. Mason turned toward the building before the past could answer in his place. Inside, the waiting room smelled of cold plaster, mouse nests, and old coal. Their flashlights moved across a ticket counter, broken benches, and a clock frozen at 4:17. Harlan crossed the room with his nose low, then stopped before a pair of double doors. He looked back once. Beyond them lay the room from the photographs. The long wooden table stood in the center, but it was covered in gray dust sheets. The chairs were stacked against the wall. There were no candles, no envelopes, and no signs that 8 people had recently sat there. Frost covered the tall rear window, matching the white background in every Polaroid. Mason took out Abigail's photograph and compared it with the room. For 1 second, the scene made no sense. Then Harlan took the picture gently from his hand, carried it to the far end of the table, and placed it on the floor. The dog looked from the image to a long crack in the plaster wall. The crack appeared in both. The photographs were real. They had been taken here, but not tonight. Caleb pulled back one of the dust covers. Beneath it, pieces of chalk marked the table positions. Abigail, Samuel, Nora, Esther, Owen. 3 other names. In the middle, written in larger letters, was Mason. "She rehearsed it," Luke said. Caleb nodded. 3 nights ago. She told everyone where to sit so the photographs would look identical when the actual reading happened. "The times on the back?" Mason asked. "A schedule, 5 minutes for each letter, 10 minutes at the end for whoever sat in the center." "She made them look like photographs of the future," Silas said. "To make sure Mason followed Harlan," Caleb replied. "Abigail has spent most of her life surrounded by books. She understands the difference between information and a story people cannot walk away from." The rehook was not the trick with the photographs. It was Harlan's next action. The shepherd walked to the chair marked Mason, lowered his head, and pressed his nose beneath the seat. Then he pulled out a short piece of white thread, caught on a splinter. Mason recognized it immediately. The same heavy white thread had once been used to repair the inside seam of his old Navy field jacket. The jacket had been stored in a locked trunk at his cabin for years. He took the thread from Harlan's mouth. "Abigail has never been inside my house," he said. Caleb stared at the thread, and for the first time his sarcasm disappeared. "Then somebody who has was part of the rehearsal." Silas looked toward the station entrance. A gust pushed against the building, making the old walls groan. No one spoke for several seconds. Mason searched beneath the table and found a folded tunnel map taped to the underside. The notes were precise and medical. Oxygen station, cardiac kit, generator, DRIAF, section, eastern escape stair, expected water line, maximum safe occupancy, 40-minute evacuation window. The handwriting belonged to Caleb. Mason held it up. Caleb did not deny it. "Owen Briggs inspected the maintenance siding last week. He said the chamber was stable. Weather reports showed the storm passing south until the front shifted this afternoon. You still helped them enter an abandoned tunnel. They are adults, Mason. They are 74 to 83 years old. And age does not erase the right to make a decision. It does when the decision can kill them." Caleb stepped closer. "That is exactly what the command said about the men I kept in the hospital. They said I had no right to decide they were too injured to return. You signed the report agreeing I had acted alone." Mason's jaw tightened. There it was. Not the whole wound, but its outline. He removed the leather book from Harlan's pouch and carried it to a rusted heating stove in the corner. Luke found old paper and coaxed a small flame from Abigail's match. Mason held the second page near the heat. Letters slowly surfaced. Caleb Ross did not lose his career because he lied. He lost it because a friend signed his name before asking. The sentence ended at the torn edge of the page. The next sheet had been removed. Mason looked across the flame. Caleb's face had gone still. "Don't ask me to forgive you when you don't even know what you did." Mason could have answered that he knew exactly what he had signed, that regulations mattered because chaos killed men, that Caleb had altered medical files without authorization. Every defense was technically true. Technical truth had already cost them 14 years. Before Mason could speak, Harlan struck the floor once, hard. The dog moved across the room and planted himself in front of the station's outer doors. Mason reached for the handle anyway. Harlan pressed his shoulder against Mason's legs. A deep crack rolled overhead. Mason stepped back. The snow load tore loose from the roof and crashed over the platform in a white avalanche. The double doors buckled inward, but held. Snow packed against the outside, sealing the entrance. Luke checked the side windows. "We're not digging through that without equipment." Caleb lifted his flashlight toward a narrow stairwell behind the ticket counter. "The tunnel access is below." From somewhere deep beneath the station came 4 slow musical notes. They were thin, metallic, and impossibly gentle in the darkness. Esther Wynn's signal. Harlan turned toward the stairs. Mason took one step after him, but Silas caught his forearm. The pastor's grip was stronger than it looked. "If Abigail has already removed the safe from the records chamber," Silas said, "you need to understand something before you go down there." Mason faced him. "Caleb's is not the only name you will find inside." Silas's eyes dropped to the old seal insignia partly visible in Mason's shirt pocket. "Your name is in there too." Below them, the 4 notes sounded again. This time, a 5th sound followed. 3 slow knocks from inside the mountain. The 3 knocks from inside the mountain did not come again. Harlan descended first, his black and tan body moving through the narrow stairwell with controlled certainty. Nose low, ears turning toward sounds the others could not yet separate from the old station's groans. Mason followed with a flashlight in one hand and the leather book secured beneath his camouflage shirt. Caleb came behind him carrying the red medical bag, while Luke managed the oxygen cylinder. Silas took the rear, his silver cross catching the light each time he looked back toward the station above, as though part of him still hoped the snow would release the door and offer him another way to avoid what waited below. The air changed halfway down. It became colder, heavier, and touched with coal dust, rust, and the mineral smell of water moving somewhere behind stone. Mason's boots found each step carefully. He had crossed tunnels on other continents, places where men hid explosives in walls, and mercy was often the first casualty of fear. This tunnel was quieter, but it carried a different kind of danger. It had been waiting nearly 50 years for someone to say what happened inside it. At the foot of the stairs, the passage widened around 2 abandoned tracks. Old signal cables hung from the brickwork like dead vines. Harlan paused, pressed his muzzle close to the rail, and turned left. 4 gentle notes sounded again from deeper in the darkness. They came from a small music box, not a ghost or a distant bell. But the melody was thin enough to feel like a prayer remembered by stone. They found the maintenance carriage on a side track nearly 200 yards into the mountain. Its faded yellow paint had darkened beneath decades of soot, and a sheet of canvas had been stretched across its windows to hold in heat. A portable oil heater glowed behind the glass. 2 battery lamps hung from ceiling hooks. Beside the carriage were stacked water containers, folded blankets, canned food, a second oxygen bottle, and a radio connected to an old tunnel antenna. Arrows painted in white chalk marked 2 exit routes, one back toward the station and another leading east through a maintenance corridor. Someone had prepared carefully. That did not mean someone had prepared wisely. Owen Briggs opened the carriage door. At 83, the retired railroad supervisor was tall, despite a permanent bend in his back. His shoulders remained broad beneath a dark brown railway coat with a corduroy collar, and a short white beard covered a face worn rough by weather, machinery, and years of avoiding mirrors when his conscience felt especially loud. His large hands were scarred and calloused, the hands of a man who understood steel better than people and trusted bolts, because bolts did not ask why he had waited so long. "You brought half the town," Owen said. "Only the half that followed the dog," Mason answered. Inside were 6 other elderly residents. Nora Bell sat nearest the heater, a sturdy 74-year-old widow with short silver curls, blue eyes, and the alert expression of a woman who had spent decades behind a post office counter, learning which neighbors lied badly and which carried grief in silence. She wore a navy quilted coat over a brick red sweater and kept one gloved hand over a sealed envelope in her lap. Esther Wynne occupied the bench opposite her. 76 and slender, Esther had an oval face, warm brown eyes, and white hair arranged in a low bun. A silver musical note brooch rested on her plum-colored wool coat. Her long fingers still hovered over the tiny music box she had used to send the 4-note signal, moving with the unconscious precision of a woman who had once corrected children gently, because she believed humiliation killed more music than poor technique ever could. Dr. Samuel Keene sat beside the oxygen bottle. He was 81, thin and pale, with tortoiseshell glasses, sparse white hair, and age spots across hands that trembled lightly even when he was calm. A brown cardigan hung from his narrow shoulders, and a hearing aid rested behind his left ear. He had spent most of his life delivering difficult truths to frightened families. Now he looked like a man who had misplaced the courage to deliver his own. The remaining 3 were less familiar to Mason. Frank Delaney, 78, was a former brakeman with a barrel chest, a flattened nose, and eyebrows, as white and thick as frost on wire. Lillian Price, 80, had once kept the paper mill's accounts. She was small, straight-backed, and severe, with gray hair pinned beneath a knitted cap and a ledger clutched against her chest. George Morrow, 77, was a retired mill electrician with dark skin, close-cropped white hair, and 2 missing fingers on his left hand. He stood near the radio, calm in the way of men who had spent their lives around dangerous current and learned that panic made poor insulation. 7 people. Abigail was not among them. Mason entered the carriage. "Where is she?" No one answered immediately. That silence told him more than panic would have. Owen shut the door against the tunnel cold. "Abigail left for the old dispatch room 20 minutes ago." "With whom?" "Alone." Silas's voice sharpened. "You allowed a 79-year-old woman with a cardiac history to walk deeper into an abandoned tunnel alone?" Nora looked at him. "That is rich, coming from a man who let her walk through 50 years carrying your family's silence." Luke shifted uneasily. Caleb did not. Mason studied the supplies. "The community center cameras were disabled. A maintenance truck left through the rear lane. You staged the disappearance." George raised his damaged hand. 7 minutes without cameras. I rewired that system when the town upgraded it. It was not difficult." "Owen drove the truck," Lillian said. "We parked it near the east access." "The photographs?" Mason asked. "Abigail's idea," Nora replied. "She said a plain letter might be ignored. A mystery would bother you until you followed." "She was right," Caleb said. Mason gave him a brief look. Owen spread a tunnel diagram across a crate. "Tomorrow morning, the town council votes on Martin Vale's emergency closure proposal. Once Vale infrastructure fills the eastern shaft with concrete, no one gets into the records chamber again. The old dispatch books, the maintenance safe, and what remains of the original scene will be gone." "Why not give what you have to Deputy Donnelly tonight?" Mason asked. "Because none of us has enough alone," Lillian said. She tapped the ledger. "I have payment entries that should not exist." Frank touched the envelope inside his coat. "I have my brother's letter." George nodded toward an old electrical schematic. "I know when the tunnel lights were cut and when they came back." Esther closed the music box. "I remember what the trapped passengers sang while they waited." Samuel looked at his hands. "And Dr. Keene remembers who was still breathing," Nora said. The carriage grew quiet. Owen explained that each person held only one piece. Some documents could be dismissed as clerical errors. Memories could be challenged by age. Letters could be called grief. They had come to place everything together, record their statements, and decide whether the chain was strong enough to survive lawyers, politics, and the anger of families who had built respectable lives on buried choices. Abigail wanted Mason as an independent witness, Esther said. Why me? Mason asked. Nora gave Caleb a glance. Caleb looked away. Silas noticed. You knew about this. I knew they planned a meeting, Caleb said. Not a disappearance. Not threats. Not Abigail walking away with the safe key. Mason faced him. You prepared the medical stations. I also told them the weather could change. You should have stopped them. Nora laughed once, without humor. There it is. The former officer enters the room and decides age has made the rest of us children. Samuel lifted one shaking hand. We are not children, Mr. Reed. But neither are we united. The confession altered the room. Nora wanted every document released publicly before anyone could bury it again. Samuel wanted Claire Donnelly to take the evidence quietly and protect innocent descendants. Owen wanted to confess his own part, but feared his grandchildren would be treated as though guilt traveled through blood. Esther wanted only the names of the dead cleared. Frank wanted the old paper mill stripped of every honor it had ever received. Lillian wanted facts, not revenge. George had come because the tunnel would be closed at sunrise, and because, in his words, a man ought to see the room where he left his courage before God asks what he did with it. They had arrived together. They had not arrived for the same reason. Mason looked at the empty seat where Abigail should have been and understood the danger more clearly. The storm was not the only force that could trap them underground. Grief had its own weather. Anger could close exits faster than snow. Samuel began to speak. Abigail believes Silas must confess in front of all of us. She believes if he is allowed to speak privately, he will turn remorse into another sermon. Silas flinched. Samuel pressed a hand to his sternum. Harlan moved before anyone else. The shepherd crossed the carriage, struck the metal floor 3 times, and leaned his broad body against Samuel's knees. Samuel's face had lost its color. Caleb was beside him instantly. Luke, oxygen. Nora, move the heater back. Samuel, look at me. Caleb's voice changed when he treated the sick. The bitterness disappeared, leaving calm authority and something gentler beneath it. He checked Samuel's pulse, opened the metal cardiac box, and placed a tablet beneath the old doctor's tongue. Luke fitted the oxygen line, while Harlan remained pressed against Samuel's legs, steady as a wall. Mason cleared the cramped space without being asked. For 14 years, he had remembered Caleb as the man accused of altering medical files. He had forgotten how many frightened men had trusted Caleb's hands before they trusted orders, medicine, or mourning. Samuel's breathing gradually slowed. Caleb kept 2 fingers at his wrist. Stay with me. Samuel managed a weak smile. I have been avoiding this night for 48 years. It would be embarrassing to leave before my portion. The words drew no laughter. When his pulse stabilized, Samuel asked to sit upright. Harlan lowered himself across the old man's boots, but did not look away. That was the rehook the night needed. Not a new document, but a living demonstration that Caleb's instinct had always been to protect the person in front of him, even when rules, careers, and friends stood elsewhere. Mason felt the old report like a weight beneath his ribs. Samuel removed his glasses. I was 33 when the train left the rails. They called me from the clinic because the regular county doctor was snowed in. When I arrived, the tunnel had already been closed to volunteers. By whose order? Mason asked. Edwin Gray and the mill superintendent. Silas lowered his head at the sound of his father's name. Samuel continued. I entered later, after equipment had been moved. 3 passengers were still alive, perhaps more before I arrived. One man had a fractured pelvis. A young mother was conscious. Another woman kept calling her son's name. Nora covered her mouth. The death certificates say they died on impact, Mason said. I signed them. Why? Samuel looked toward the tunnel wall, as though the answer had remained written there all these years. They told me the true times would prove rescue had been delayed. The mill would close. Hundreds would lose work in winter. Families would lose heat. Children would go hungry. And you believed them? I needed to. Samuel's eyes filled but did not spill. I told myself the dead could not be restored by destroying the living. That was the sentence I used whenever I woke, hearing that woman call for her child. He reached beneath his seat and brought out a thick envelope. Mason's name was written across it. Inside was a copy of the military inquiry into Caleb Ross. Several medical evaluations had been altered. Deployment status had been delayed. The final confirmation stated that Caleb had acted without authorization or knowledge of his team. Mason Reed's signature appeared beneath it. I confirmed a procedural fact, Mason said, hearing how small the defense sounded. Caleb's brown eyes did not leave him. Yes, you confirmed the smallest truth, so you would not have to ask about the larger one. Mason folded the report once. Where is Abigail? He asked. Samuel hesitated. She went to the dispatch room for Silas and the key to Edwin Gray's safe. I tried to stop her. I said we should call Claire before opening anything. What did Abigail do? She locked me in the supply compartment until Owen let me out. Nora's expression hardened. She said you were panicking. I was afraid, Samuel answered. Fear does not erase a man's right to leave. Even Abigail, the widow who had carried the burden longest, had begun deciding for others in the name of justice. Mason turned the report over. Abigail had written a message across the back. Before Mason decides whether Silas deserves punishment or forgiveness, let him remember that his silence once destroyed a good man who was still alive. Mason looked at Caleb. Caleb's face held no triumph, only exhaustion. The 9th chair is not for an innocent man, he said. He paused, then glanced toward the empty place beside Samuel. But Abigail still has not told you why she chose you. The report remained folded in Mason's hand long after the others stopped looking at it. Around him, the maintenance carriage breathed with the small mechanical sounds of survival. The oil heater ticking, oxygen flowing through Samuel's mask, wind pressing against stone somewhere beyond the tunnel walls. Harlan lay across Samuel Keene's boots, his amber eyes half closed, but his ears still working. Caleb stood near the open carriage door, with the red medical bag at his feet. He had just saved an old man's life with the same calm hands Mason had once helped remove from military service. What did you change? Mason asked. Caleb looked at him. You read the report. I read charges. That was enough for you last time. The words landed without force, which made them harder to resist. Mason stepped out of the carriage. The tunnel air was colder there, carrying coal dust and the wet metal smell of old rails. Caleb followed after a moment, closing the door so the elderly group would not have to watch 2 former soldiers reopen a wound they had already waited 14 years to discuss. Caleb leaned against the brick wall, favoring his right leg. We were 3 days from rotation, he said. Command had lost too many men to injuries, and too many more to paperwork. Numbers were beginning to look bad. Mason remembered the base hospital, fluorescent lights, sand in every door hinge, men pretending pain was temporary because the mission schedule said it had to be. Caleb continued. Dawson was still bleeding internally. His blood pressure dropped every time he stood. Pritchard had lost most of his hearing after the blast. He could read lips if the room was quiet, but they wanted to put him back beside live fire. Kent failed 2 cognitive checks and forgot where he had placed his weapon. 2 others could barely close their hands around a rifle. You altered their evaluations. I corrected what the official forms were about to erase. You falsified records. Yes. Caleb did not soften the word. He did not hide behind good intentions. I changed their return to duty status. I delayed deployment. I signed another physician's authorization because he was too frightened to sign it himself. You could have gone through command. I did. Colonel Mercer told me the unit needed bodies, not excuses. Mason knew Mercer, a decorated officer, a man whose retirement speech had included the words duty and brotherhood so often that everyone in attendance had stood before realizing they had been asked to. At least 2 of those men would have died, Caleb said. Maybe more. Dawson needed surgery 6 hours later. Kent suffered a seizure the next morning. Mason's fingers tightened around the folded report. Why wasn't that in the inquiry? It was in my statement. I never saw it. You never asked to. The tunnel seemed to narrow. Mason looked past Caleb toward the darkness. They asked whether you acted without authorization. And you said I did. It was true. Yes. Caleb nodded slowly. The smallest truth in the room. Mason's voice hardened. I could not destroy an entire command structure based on one man's claim. Caleb's face did not change, but something behind his eyes did. I never asked you to destroy the unit. You expected me to defend you without evidence. I expected you to walk into the hospital and ask why. Mason turned toward him. Caleb's mouth pulled into a tired, humorless smile. That was all. One question from the man who had trusted me with his blood, his men, and every bad decision we survived together. Why didn't you tell me? I was under investigation. You were ordered not to discuss the case with me. That never stopped us before. No. Caleb's gaze held his. But I wanted to know whether friendship would bring you through the door without an order. Mason said nothing. I waited 3 days, Caleb continued, then 7, then until the hearing. After they stripped my rank, I still thought maybe you would come by the infirmary before I left. Mason remembered those days too clearly now. He had passed the infirmary twice. Both times he had told himself Caleb needed space. Both times he had chosen the corridor that did not require him to face the possibility that his signature had been legally correct and morally wrong. I thought you wanted to be left alone, Mason said. Caleb looked down the tunnel. That is what people tell themselves when they are afraid the wounded man might speak. The rehook came quietly. Harlan rose inside the carriage and stepped into the passage. He carried something small between his teeth. The dog crossed directly to Mason and placed a hearing aid on the toe of his boot. Samuel's hearing aid. Caleb straightened. He had it when we stabilized him. Harlan turned toward a narrow service corridor behind the carriage. His nose lowered. He took 3 steps, looked back, and waited. Mason glanced through the carriage window. Samuel was still seated inside, one hand touching his bare left ear, confusion spreading across his face. How did that get out here? Luke asked from the doorway. Samuel answered through the open door. I lost it earlier, when Abigail locked me in the storage compartment. The hearing aid had not fallen near the carriage. Abigail or someone following her had carried it deeper into the tunnel. Harlan moved again. Mason followed. The service corridor was barely wide enough for 2 men. Old shelves leaned against the brick walls, holding warped ledgers, signal lamps, and rusted tools. Harlan stopped at a steel door with a railroad emblem stamped into its center. A shallow scratch marked the floor beneath it, as though something heavy had recently been dragged through. Owen joined them carrying a hand lantern. Records room, he said. Hasn't been opened in years. The lock had already been broken. Inside stood rows of metal filing cabinets, their drawers swollen shut with moisture. At the far wall rested a black iron safe, waist-high and heavy enough to survive fire, flood, or the conscience of anyone who hoped time would solve both. The faded insignia of the Brightwater Rail Company appeared on its door. Beneath it, engraved into a brass plate, were 2 words: Edwin Gray. Silas stopped behind Mason. For the first time that night, the pastor looked less like a man protecting a secret, and more like a son entering the room where his father's voice had never stopped speaking. "The safe belonged to him?" Mason asked. Silas nodded. "My father was the railboard's legal advisor. He also represented the paper mill." Mason tested the handle. Locked. Owen pointed to a narrow keyway. "Special freight office key. Only 2 were made." "Where are they?" "One disappeared after the accident." Owen's eyes dropped. "Abigail has the other." Mason looked at the fresh scrape on the floor. "She came here." "Or meant to move the safe," Caleb said. "No," Owen replied. "Even 4 strong men would struggle. She came for what is inside." The old railroad supervisor set the lantern on a cabinet. The light sharpened the lines in his weathered face. "I was 25 the night the train left the rails," he said. "Snow packed the switch. The signal failed. The front carriage struck the wall and pulled the rest sideways." "So the accident was real," Mason said. "Yes. Nobody planned it." Owen drew a slow breath. What happened afterward was planned. He explained that the paper mill had been receiving industrial fuel through the rail line under falsified shipping codes. The fuel was cheaper than approved supplies and far more dangerous. Several drums had been loaded into a maintenance carriage attached behind the passenger cars. If investigators saw them, Owen said, the mill would close, maybe for months, maybe forever. Brightwater had depended on that mill. Families bought food with its wages. Churches heated their buildings with its donations. The town school, the clinic, and half the houses in the valley existed because of it. "Edwin Gray told us to move the drums before county investigators arrived," Owen said. "He said rescue crews had to wait until the tunnel was made safe." "But it was not about safety," Mason said. Owen shook his head. "It was about evidence. You moved the fuel. I drove the maintenance engine, while people were trapped." Owen's large hands closed into fists. "I heard them." His voice broke on the last word. "I told myself I had a pregnant wife at home. I told myself if the mill closed, hundreds of children would suffer. I told myself the rescuers would go in soon." He looked at Silas. "Your father told us 10 minutes. How long?" Mason asked. Owen did not answer at first. "Almost 3 hours." No one spoke. Faith was often described as trusting what couldn't be seen. Mason wondered how many sins began when men used the same idea to avoid looking at what was directly in front of them. Samuel had left the carriage with Luke supporting one arm. His face remained pale, but his eyes were clear. "Silas did not cause the wreck," Samuel said. "He was 15. But he knew Abigail's husband was alive when the tunnel door was—" The explosion came from behind them. It was not large. A blunt concussion rolled through the passage, extinguishing the lantern and throwing dust from the ceiling. The floor jumped beneath Mason's boots. Harlan barked once, sharp and commanding, then moved against Samuel before the old doctor lost his balance. Darkness swallowed the room. A second later, Mason's flashlight cut through it. "Count," he ordered. Everyone answered. No injuries. From the direction of the carriage came shouting. Mason ran back with Caleb and found part of the service passage collapsed. Broken brick and timber blocked the route toward the station stairs. Dust filled the beam of his flashlight. Owen touched a blackened fragment near the rubble. "That did not come from the old structure." Mason knelt. A yellow plastic thread ran beneath the debris, fresh detonation cord. "Industrial charge," he said. "Placed recently." The radio inside the carriage crackled. George adjusted the antenna until a woman's voice forced its way through the static. "Mason Reed, respond." Mason took the handset. "Read here." "This is Deputy Claire Donnelly." He knew Claire by reputation, and by the few winter rescues they had worked together. At 59, she was a solidly built woman of medium height, with an angular face, short brown-gray hair usually tucked behind her ears, and blue-gray eyes that gave little away. A thin scar crossed her right eyebrow. She wore the dark navy winter uniform of the Brightwater Sheriff's Office, with a heavy police coat, black tactical boots, and a body camera she kept running even when other officers considered it inconvenient. Claire was disciplined, direct, and slow to trust easy explanations, perhaps because she had grown up in a town where family names often carried more authority than facts. "I'm at the Eastern Access," she said. Martin Vale sent a construction crew to the mountain under an emergency stabilization order. Martin Vale was 57, chairman of the town council and owner of Vale Infrastructure. He was known for immaculate gray coats, polished black boots, and the calm manners of a man who had never needed to raise his voice because money already entered the room before he did. His grandfather had owned the paper mill when the train derailed. "The council has not voted," Mason said. "I know. Vale claims the storm created immediate collapse risk. His crew has blasting permits for surface rock, not the interior tunnel. Someone just fired a charge underground." Claire was silent for half a second. "Then this is not stabilization." Silas looked toward the locked safe. Mason tightened his grip on the radio. "Can you reach us?" "I'm working through the east maintenance door. It has been welded from the outside." "By Vale's crew?" "I have not confirmed that." Static climbed between them. Then Claire's voice returned, lower now. "Mason, there is something you need to know before you decide whether to trust me." He waited. "My father's name is on the list of men who were in that tunnel the night the train went down." The signal dissolved into a wash of interference. Mason lowered the radio. Somewhere beyond the rubble, metal struck metal. Harlan turned toward the sound, ears forward, body perfectly still. Claire Donnelly was coming through the eastern door. Mason no longer knew whether she intended to preserve the evidence or bury the last piece of her father with it. The old dispatch room lay beyond a sloping corridor where water ran in thin black lines between the bricks. Mason moved first, flashlight raised, his broad frame filling the narrow passage. Caleb followed with the medical bag, and Harlan traveled between them, nose close to the ground, the shepherd's scarred right ear turning toward every metallic groan inside the mountain. Behind them, the others remained near the maintenance carriage with Luke and Owen. Silas had disappeared during the confusion after the blast, but his tracks were easy to follow. Clean black boot prints pressed into coal dust, moving toward the room where his father had once controlled trains, workers, and for one terrible night, the value of human lives. The dispatch room door stood open. Abigail Mercer sat behind the dead signal desk as though she had been waiting to preside over a trial. At 79, she was small and fine-boned, but nothing about her seemed frail. White hair cut neatly to her chin framed a narrow, intelligent face. Wire-framed glasses rested before pale blue eyes, sharpened by 50 years of grief. She wore the same dark green wool coat from the Polaroid, buttoned over a cream turtleneck, with a long brown skirt, thick stockings, and low brown boots. A burgundy scarf circled her neck, and her thin right hand closed around an old pocket watch belonging to the husband she had lost in the tunnel. Silas stood on the opposite side of the room. He was unarmed. His charcoal overcoat was dusted with soot, the white clerical collar at his throat almost luminous in the flashlight beams. Between Abigail and Silas, arranged across the signal desk, lay a brass key, an old sealed letter, a cassette recorder, Esther's music box, and a black and white photograph of the wreck before the scene had been altered. You found him, Mason said. Abigail looked at Harlan. He found me first. The shepherd did not go to her immediately. He watched her breathing, then Silas's, as though deciding which human body carried the more urgent danger. You threatened to expose everything unless he came, Mason said. I promised to expose everything. You gave him no chance to explain. I gave him 48 years. Silas lowered his eyes. She sent copies of the first ledger page to 3 newspapers. They will be released automatically at midnight unless she cancels the delivery. Mason looked at Abigail. And if the evidence is incomplete? The evidence is incomplete because men like him have spent half a century deciding when the rest of us were ready for it. Samuel wanted to call the police. Samuel has wanted to call the police for 20 years. He always changes his mind before reaching the telephone. So you locked him in a compartment. A flicker crossed Abigail's face. I needed 1 hour. He asked to leave. He was frightened. Fear does not cancel consent. The words were Samuel's, and Abigail knew it. Her fingers tightened around the pocket watch. Silas stepped nearer the desk. Mason, before you judge her too harshly, understand that I taught this town to confuse my silence with wisdom. Abigail gave a bitter laugh. There, that voice, the gentle confession. Even his guilt arrives wearing Sunday clothes. Silas accepted the insult without protest. I was 15 when the train left the tracks, he said. My father took me with him because the roads were blocked, and he needed someone small enough to crawl beneath the maintenance gate. The dispatch room seemed to change around his memory. Mason could almost see the storm of another winter, the lamps trembling, frightened men entering with snow on their coats and authority in their voices. Silas continued. I heard people inside the wreck. A woman was calling for a boy named Thomas. Another man was beating metal against metal. I told my father we had to open the tunnel. His left hand turned palm down on the desk, revealing the old burn scar across its back. He held me by that hand because I tried to run past him. He said the fuel drums had to be removed first. He said if investigators found them, the mill would close. Silas looked at Abigail. He told me, if the mill closes, the whole town will die slower than they will. Even Abigail's anger went still. The adults moved the drums, Silas said. They changed the dispatch ledger. They stopped volunteers from entering. My father told everyone the carriage might explode, though the real danger was that someone would photograph what was inside. You knew my husband was alive, Abigail said. Yes, the word came without defense. How long? Silas's throat worked before he answered. I heard his watch striking the wall. He had shown it to me in church 2 weeks earlier. He said the hinge was broken and the chime sounded ugly. But you had given it to him on your wedding day, so he would never replace it. Abigail opened her hand. The pocket watch lay silent in her palm. He was alive when you went home, she said. Silas closed his eyes. Yes. Mason had seen men withstand interrogation better than they withstood one honest word. When I grew older, Silas continued, I inherited my father's money. I used it to build the food kitchen, the heating fund, the veterans clinic. I paid mortgages when families were about to lose their homes. I helped keep Brightwater alive. All true, Mason said. Silas looked relieved for half a second. Mason finished. None of it returned the truth to the families. The relief vanished. Silas faced him. If this comes out carelessly, the church may lose its donors. The kitchen closes. The heating fund disappears. Families who had nothing to do with the wreck will pay for the sins of men already dead. I don't protect my father anymore, he said, turning to Abigail. I protect the people who eat from a kitchen, carrying his name. Abigail rose. Her small body trembled, but her voice did not. You are still deciding how much the truth of the dead is worth. You simply learn to call that decision mercy. Silas's expression tightened in genuine pain. That was what made him dangerous. He was not pretending to care. His generosity was real. So was the shelter he had given, the food he had served, and the hands he had held beside hospital beds. But somewhere along the way, he had mistaken being needed for being right. He had turned kindness into permission to control what others were allowed to know. Mason understood the temptation. A man who saved enough people could begin believing every choice belonged to him. He turned to Abigail. "And you? You decided Samuel was not allowed to leave. You brought 7 elderly people underground without telling them how bad the storm had become. You used Caleb's wound to bring me here. You sent Harlan into the blizzard alone. Harlan knew the route. He is a dog, not a promise you can spend." Harlan's head lifted at the sharpness in Mason's voice. Abigail looked down at him, and for the first time her certainty weakened. "I needed Silas to stand where my husband died and speak without a pulpit between us. You wanted justice?" "Yes." "Only justice?" She did not answer. Mason stepped closer. "Did you want the truth known? Or did you want the town to look at him the way it once looked at you? With pity, whispers, and relief that the suffering belonged to someone else?" Abigail's face hardened. "He deserves to lose what he built. That is not the same as the dead receiving justice. I know the difference." Harlan struck the floor 3 times. Everyone froze. The shepherd crossed to Abigail and pressed his shoulder against her knees. Her face had gone gray beneath the pale skin. One hand moved uncertainly toward her chest. Caleb was beside her before the pocket watch hit the desk. "Sit down." "I'm fine." "No, you are angry, frightened, and having an irregular rhythm." "Sit." She tried to resist, but her legs softened. Mason caught her elbow, while Caleb lowered her into the chair. He opened the medical bag and reached for the medication. "Where are your tablets?" he asked. "In the carriage." Caleb looked up sharply. "You came deeper into the tunnel without them." "I forgot." "No," Mason said. "You left them because carrying medicine would mean admitting you might not control the night." Abigail stared at him, too breathless to answer. Caleb gave her a tablet, checked her pulse, and instructed her to breathe slowly. Harlan remained pressed against her legs, amber eyes fixed on her face. The same dog she had sent through the storm now held her to the living world with nothing more than warmth and trained patience. While Mason and Caleb worked, Silas stood close enough to take the brass key. The old letter also lay within his reach. He could have thrown both into the signal room furnace. He could have protected his father, his church, and the good works built from inherited guilt. His hand moved. Mason saw it but did not release Abigail. Silas picked up the key. Then he crossed the room and placed it in Mason's palm. "No more deciding for them," he said. Abigail looked at him, her breathing still shallow. It was not forgiveness. It was not even repentance completed. But it was the first honest surrender Silas had made. They returned to the records room once Abigail's pulse steadied. Caleb insisted she remain seated in a wheeled maintenance chair that George had found near the corridor. She protested until Harlan stood in front of her and refused to move. Mason inserted the brass key into Edwin Gray's safe. The lock resisted, then opened with a deep mechanical snap. Inside were carbon copies of dispatch logs, invoices for industrial fuel disguised as paper mill solvent, an order-delaying rescue entry, photographs of fuel drums beside the passenger carriage, and a list of men assigned to remove them. There were altered death certificates showing false times, an old escape map, and a sealed letter signed by Edwin Gray. Claire had been right. This was no collection of memories that lawyers could dismiss as age or bitterness. It was a chain. Motive, action, falsification, and concealment. Mason unfolded the participant list. Owen Briggs appeared near the top. Edwin Gray, the mill superintendent, 2 rail officials, a young doctor named Samuel Keene. Near the bottom was another name, Patrick Donnelly, Claire's father. A beam of light appeared at the far end of the corridor. Harlan turned first, positioning himself between the safe and the approaching figure. Deputy Claire Donnelly emerged through the dust. Her dark navy winter uniform was streaked with rust, and snow melted across the shoulders of her heavy police coat. She was medium height, solidly built, with an angular face, short brown-gray hair tucked behind her ears, and a thin scar crossing her right eyebrow. Her blue-gray eyes moved from Mason to Abigail, then to Silas, and finally to the open safe. She saw her father's name in Mason's hand. Something broke quietly behind her expression. Claire stepped forward and reached toward the evidence. For one long second, no one knew whether she meant to seal the safe or close it forever. Claire Donnelly's hand stopped inches above the open safe. For a moment, Mason saw two people struggling behind her blue-gray eyes. The daughter who remembered a broad hand teaching her to tie fishing knots, and the deputy who had sworn that no family name would stand above the law. Patrick Donnelly had raised her after her mother died. He had packed her school lunches, attended every academy ceremony, and taught her that a badge meant doing the difficult thing before anyone applauded. Now his name lay among men who had delayed a rescue while people froze inside the mountain. Claire slowly withdrew her hand. Then she pressed the button on her body camera. A red light appeared beneath her shoulder badge. "Deputy Claire Donnelly," she said, her voice controlled despite the faint tremor in it. "December 17th, 11:38 p.m., Interior Records Chamber, eastern section of the abandoned Brightwater Rail Tunnel. Present are Mason Reed, Caleb Ross, Reverend Silas Gray, Abigail Mercer, and K9 Medical Support Dog Harlan. Additional witnesses are located in the maintenance carriage west of this position." She put on black evidence gloves before touching anything. One by one, she photographed the safe, the lock, the key, the documents as they lay, and the names on the participation list. She read each item aloud. The carbon dispatch ledger, falsified fuel invoices, delayed entry order, altered death certificates, original escape map, photographs of the wreck before the scene had been changed, and Edwin Gray's sealed confession. When Claire reached Patrick Donnelly's name, her voice faltered. Only once. She recovered and continued. "I cannot choose the father I had," she said, "but I can choose the police officer I become tonight." Abigail closed her eyes. Silas lowered his head. Mason felt something inside the room shift, not forgiveness and not relief, but the first clean movement of justice. Claire could love her father and still refuse to protect what he had done. The two truths did not cancel each other. Perhaps faith was not believing good people had never failed. Perhaps it was believing failure did not excuse another generation from choosing better. Claire placed the primary documents into evidence sleeves and sealed them with numbered tape. The personal letters remained with their owners, but would be read before her camera. She radioed the serial numbers to dispatch, creating a record outside the mountain in case the tunnel did not release them. They returned to the maintenance carriage. The table from the Polaroids had been assembled inside the widened service bay beside the old rail car. 8 chairs stood around it, exactly as they had in Abigail's staged photographs. Abigail, Samuel, Nora, Esther, Owen, Frank, Lillian, and George took their places. Each had an envelope before them and a candle that remained unlit because the air already smelled faintly of fuel and damp stone. Mason sat in the 9th chair. Caleb stood behind him near the medical supplies. Claire positioned herself beside the table where her camera could record every face. Silas remained at the far end, outside the circle. He had not been given a chair. That absence seemed appropriate. Tonight was not arranged to grant him authority. It was arranged to make him listen. Mason looked around the table. "You brought me here to decide what happens to the evidence." "No," Abigail said. Her face remained pale after the cardiac episode, but her voice had regained its iron. "We brought you here because Caleb said you would risk your life before you would sit still long enough to hear why someone had broken a rule." Mason glanced behind him. Caleb did not deny it. "The 9th chair is not a judge's seat," Esther said softly. "It is a witness's chair." Nora rested both hands on her envelope. "Your only duty is to stay until we finish." For Mason, staying had always been harder than entering. A rescue gave him movement, commands, and clear danger. Listening required him to remain defenseless, while another person rearranged the story he had used to live with himself. He nodded. Nora opened the first letter. The paper had been folded so many times the creases were close to tearing. Her husband had written it 3 weeks after the wreck, before illness and pressure persuaded him never to speak publicly. His words described arriving with volunteer rescuers and seeing lantern light through a gap in the tunnel barrier. He both heard people calling. He knew they were alive. Nora's voice broke only at the final line. "Do not let anger become the only thing you keep from me." She folded the letter against her chest. Samuel spoke next. He did not reread the altered death certificates. He had memorized every false time. "I believed the dead would never know I had been a coward," he said. "But the living knew. My wife knew each time I woke shouting. My children knew every time I refused to discuss that winter. The patients I asked to trust me never knew that I had once signed away the truth of 3 dying people." Owen placed his large, scarred hands flat on the table. "My wife was 7 months pregnant," he said. "Edwin Gray told me the mill would close before morning if investigators saw those fuel drums. I drove the maintenance engine while people called from the wreck. I said I was choosing my family." His eyes moved toward Mason. "But I never asked what the trapped men had chosen for theirs." Esther opened her music box. 4 thin notes entered the tunnel. Harlan lifted his head. The notes were simple, part of an old hymn Mason remembered hearing in small churches, where elderly voices carried more faith than volume. Esther explained that the passengers had sung those 4 notes again and again, so the children would not hear the adults crying. She had been standing outside the tunnel entrance as a young volunteer teacher. For years, she could not enter a church without hearing the same melody beneath every prayer. When the music stopped, Harlan rose. He walked around the table, sniffed the floor beneath Esther's chair, and placed one paw against the rail. His ears angled downward. For a moment, everyone thought he was responding to the hymn. Then a vibration passed through the metal, so faint that Mason felt it more in his boots than heard it. Harlan looked toward the dark eastern passage. The sound vanished. Owen frowned, but the room was quiet again. Claire opened a letter found among her father's personal papers after his death. Patrick Donnelly had written it to the sheriff but never mailed it. He admitted helping carry fuel drums away from the wreck. He also claimed he tried to return with blankets and tools after realizing people remained alive. But Edwin Gray threatened to have him arrested and blacklisted from every job in the county. Claire paused. The letter did not make her father innocent. It made him human, which was harder. "He was frightened," she said. "He obeyed. Then he spent the rest of his life teaching me courage, as if he could place in me what he had failed to find in himself." She slipped the letter into an evidence sleeve. Caleb stepped to the table and laid down the military report carrying Mason's signature. "This document has nothing to do with the train," he said. "It belongs here because silence does not only bury the dead. Sometimes it ruins the person still standing in front of you." His gaze rested on Mason. A man can tell the smallest truth and use it to avoid the larger one. A system can call that integrity. A friend can call it procedure. The wounded man calls it abandonment. Mason did not defend himself. For the first time in 14 years, he stayed in the chair. Abigail spoke next. Her pocket watch lay beside her envelope. "I told myself I wanted the truth," she said. "That was true. But it was not the whole truth." She looked at Silas. "I wanted him to lose the way I lost. I wanted people to lower their voices when he entered a room. I wanted his name to become something families whispered over dinner. I did not merely want him to confess. I wanted him to suffer long enough for me to believe the scales had moved." Silas accepted the words without lowering his gaze. Abigail's mouth trembled. "That is why I locked Samuel in the compartment. That is why I hid the changing weather report. I began the night asking Silas to stop deciding for everyone else. And then, I did the same thing. No one offered easy comfort. Forgiveness without accountability was only another method of hiding." Silas finally stepped toward the table. Claire turned her camera to him. He opened Edwin Gray's letter. "If the truth is ever discovered," Silas read, "tell them we acted for the town." He stopped. The paper shook between his hands. "I have repeated that sentence for nearly 50 years, he said, sometimes aloud, mostly in prayer. I told myself my father had given me a burden to carry." He looked around the table at the people his family's silence had wounded. "Tonight I understand he did not give me a mission. He gave me an excuse." Silas described the delay, the fuel removal, the altered records, and every attempt he later made to persuade witnesses to remain silent. He admitted using the church's dependence on his charity to frighten Abigail away from disclosure. He had never threatened her directly. He had done something subtler. He made her believe hungry families would suffer if she told the truth. When he finished, Claire stated that his confession had been recorded. Silas nodded. Harlan stood so suddenly that his claws scraped the carriage floor. The German shepherd did not look at Silas, Abigail, or Samuel. He stared downward. His body went rigid. His tail dropped. A low warning formed in his chest. Then black water appeared between the rails. At first it was a narrow ribbon reflecting the battery lamps. Within seconds, it widened and carried coal dust, splinters, and fragments of old insulation into the service bay. Owen dropped to one knee and touched it. "Snowmelt," he said. The blast broke the upper drainage culvert. "How long?" Mason asked. Owen looked toward the slope of the tunnel and calculated with the instinct of a man who had measured danger by water lines and steel weight all his life. "Less than 20 minutes before this section fills waist-high. After that, the pressure takes the carriage." The western route was already blocked by the blast. George checked the eastern radio line and confirmed Claire's entrance had partially collapsed after she passed through. The emergency exit could still be opened, but its counterweight valve lay inside a side chamber whose sealing had begun to fail. "Someone has to hold the valve manually," Owen said. "Once released, the gate closes." Silas removed his overcoat. He did so quietly, as though preparing for ordinary work. Abigail understood first. "No." Silas folded the coat over a chair. "The rest of you cross while I hold it." "You will not get out," she said. "That is not the immediate concern. Do not turn your death into an apology I cannot refuse." Her cry struck the tunnel harder than the explosion had. Silas looked at her. "I am not asking you to forgive me. No. You are trying to die before I decide." Mason stood. "I'll go with him." Caleb caught his arm. "If you go, these people lose the man who knows how to move a group through a failing structure. I'm not leaving him alone. And you are about to make the same mistake again." Mason turned sharply. Caleb did not release him. "You think the choice is one man or everyone else. You decide alone, then carry the grave with you. Water spread beneath the table legs. Mason looked at Silas, then at Abigail, Samuel, and the others. 14 years earlier, he had trusted procedure over a friend. In every crisis since, he had tried to compensate by making himself responsible for every life in the room. This time, he did something that felt more dangerous than taking command. He asked for help. "Caleb," he said, "what do you see that I don't?" Caleb looked upward. An old cable and pulley system ran along the tunnel ceiling, connecting the maintenance carriage to the counterweight chamber. "I see a way not to leave anyone behind." His eyes returned to Mason. "But it only works if, this time, you trust the rest of us to save you too." Black water had already covered the rails when Owen Briggs dragged the old maintenance diagram onto the table. His scarred finger followed a line from the carriage winch to the eastern gate. "The gate was built to close automatically if water reached the passenger section," he said. "That counterweight holds nearly 800 pounds. Someone can pull the valve open by hand, but once he lets go, the gate drops." Water curled around the soles of his boots. "Unless we connect the carriage cable to the counterweight, then the winch can do the holding." George Morrow aimed his flashlight toward the ceiling, where an old steel cable disappeared through a row of rusted pulleys. "Cable is still seated," he said, "but the locking pin is gone." Owen pointed toward the narrow counterweight chamber. The entrance had partially collapsed, leaving a gap no wider than a man's shoulders. Beyond it, water churned through broken timber and machinery. The pin fell when the blast shook the frame. Without it, the cable slips free the moment we put weight on it. Mason studied the passage. "I can fit." "Not with those shoulders," Caleb said, "and not before the water reaches the electrical conduit." Harlan moved between them. The German shepherd lowered his silvered muzzle to the current, sniffed once, and followed the smell toward the gap. Owen knelt beside him. "The pin is coated with rail grease. Same oil we used on every coupling in this tunnel." He let Harlan smell the stained leather of his work glove, then pointed into the darkness. "Find it." Harlan looked at Mason. The dog had led him through the storm, into the station, and toward truths Mason had spent years avoiding. Now Mason had to do something harder than follow. He had to trust the dog to enter a place he could not. "Go," Mason said. Harlan slid beneath the broken frame. His thick, black and tan body vanished into the flooded chamber, leaving only the scraping of claws against submerged steel. Claire turned her radio toward the eastern shaft and transmitted their position to the rescue teams outside. The signal broke apart beneath the mountain, but enough survived for dispatch to repeat the coordinates. Caleb moved Abigail, Samuel, and the weaker members of the group onto the carriage steps, while Luke checked their breathing. Nora and Samuel placed the original letters and sealed evidence sleeves into waterproof emergency bags. Lillian read each evidence number aloud before sealing it, refusing to let panic corrupt the record they had waited half a century to create. Frank and George uncoiled the main cable. Esther stood near Owen, with the music box held between both hands. The water rose above Mason's ankles. From inside the counterweight chamber came a metallic crash, then silence. "Harlan!" Mason called. Nothing answered. He moved toward the gap, but Caleb blocked him with one arm. "Give him another second. The ceiling is moving. He knows the way back." Mason stared into the black water. Every instinct demanded that he crawl after the dog. Command had once meant recognizing when hesitation killed. But command had also taught him the lie that only his hands could save what mattered. A faint scraping came from beneath the machinery. Harlan emerged with water streaming from his coat. A short steel pin was clenched between his teeth, but a length of wire had caught around his collar. The current pulled him backward. Mason dropped to one knee and reached through the gap. His fingers touched wet fur, but could not find the collar buckle. Harlan did not panic. The dog braced his front paws against the floor and held the pin even as the wire tightened. Caleb lay flat beside Mason and reached past his shoulder with a medical cutter. "Hold him steady." Mason gripped Harlan's chest. Caleb cut the wire. The dog surged forward into Mason's arms, still refusing to release the pin until Owen held out his hand. "That," Owen whispered, taking it, "is a working dog." Harlan shook once, spraying black water across everyone within reach. Nora laughed despite herself. It was a small sound, but in the flooded tunnel, it felt like proof that fear had not yet claimed the whole room. They moved. Owen inserted the pin into the counterweight coupling, while George and Frank fed the cable through the old pulley system. Silas entered the side chamber and wrapped both hands around the manual valve. The pastor had removed his long overcoat, leaving his black clerical shirt dark with sweat and tunnel water. He looked toward Abigail before pulling. "I will hold it until the cable takes the load." "You will hold it until Mason tells you to release it," she answered. "You do not get to choose a martyr's ending." Silas nodded. Esther opened the music box. 4 hymn notes floated above the rushing water. Owen used them as a count. On the first note, Silas pulled the valve. On the second, the eastern gate began to rise. On the third, George and Frank tightened the cable. On the fourth, Owen engaged the carriage winch. The old machinery screamed. Rust flaked from the pulleys. For a moment, the cable held. "Again," Owen said. Esther restarted the melody. Claire crossed first and established a position beyond the gate, where the maintenance passage climbed toward the eastern exit. She took the evidence bags from Nora and Samuel, then returned to guide the elderly residents through one by one. Luke supported Samuel. George helped Lillian. Frank carried Esther's music box inside his coat so she could use both hands on the rail. Caleb stayed with Abigail, one hand checking her pulse, while the other steadied her through the current. Nora refused assistance until the water struck her knees, then accepted Mason's arm without pretending she had not needed it. Harlan traveled back and forth along the line, never leaving the last person until the next had reached Claire. Mason watched the cable. Each turn of the winch made the old bracket bend farther from the wall. "Last group," Owen called. Caleb guided Abigail beneath the gate. Owen followed after locking the winch. Silas remained inside the counterweight chamber, both hands still on the valve because the cable was beginning to slip against the damaged drum. Mason stepped toward him. The ceiling cracked. A timber fell between them and struck Silas across the legs, driving him into the water. The valve shifted. The eastern gate dropped several inches. "Mason!" Claire called from the far side. "We need you here!" The old choice returned with perfect cruelty. One man behind him, a group ahead, a collapsing structure between them. Years earlier, Mason would have decided alone and carried the outcome like a private grave. This time he looked at the others. "Claire?" "I have the group," she answered. "Luke and I can get them to the shaft." "Caleb?" Caleb looped both arms around the cable where it fed through the guide. "I can hold tension with Owen." "Owen?" The old railroad man seized the winch handle. 30 seconds if the bracket stays. Less if God is impatient. Mason looked at Harlan. The dog was already turning back toward Silas. "Then nobody gets left," Mason said. He and Harlan went beneath the gate. Water struck Mason's thighs. He reached Silas and lifted the timber, but the wood had wedged beneath a fallen steel brace. Harlan pushed his muzzle under Silas's shoulder and pulled at the back of his shirt. "Leave me," Silas said through clenched teeth. "No," Mason answered. "You have already saved the others." "That does not make you expendable." The winch shrieked. Behind them, Caleb shouted that the cable was slipping. Mason changed position, drove one boot against the wall, and lifted again. The timber rose just enough for Silas to drag one leg free. Harlan gripped Silas's sleeve and pulled. The second leg came loose, as part of the ceiling collapsed into the place where his body had been. They moved toward the gate. The opening had narrowed to 3 feet. Harlan went first. Silas crawled after him. Mason followed as the cable strands began snapping one at a time. "Release!" Owen shouted. Caleb let go. Owen disengaged the winch. Mason rolled beneath the gate a heartbeat before it slammed shut. The impact shook dust from the tunnel roof and sent a wall of water against the steel barrier behind them. For several seconds, no one moved. Then Harlan walked directly to Abigail and placed his wet head beneath her hand. She looked at Silas, who lay breathing hard on the stones. "You are still here," she said. "So are you." It was not forgiveness, but it was life, which meant there would still be time for truth, consequences, and perhaps grace. The Eastern Rescue Team reached them 12 minutes later. By dawn, all 12 people and 1 exhausted German shepherd had emerged from the mountain. Snow had stopped falling. Pale gold light spread over Brightwater Ridge, turning the white roofs and frozen pines almost painfully beautiful. Martin Vale was waiting beside the emergency vehicles when Claire came out carrying the evidence bags. At 57, he was tall, well-groomed, and carefully composed, with a long, pale face, blue eyes, and gray-black hair combed neatly to one side. His expensive charcoal coat remained clean despite the storm, and his polished black boots looked strangely untouched by the mud surrounding the tunnel. He approached Claire with the calm concern of a man accustomed to disguising orders as assistance. "Deputy, those documents may be unstable," he said. "My company can secure them." Claire removed a set of handcuffs. Martin's polite expression finally broke. He was arrested for unauthorized use of explosives, destruction of a protected site, reckless endangerment, obstruction, and attempted concealment of historical records. The investigation that followed confirmed that the derailment itself had been accidental, caused by snow-packed switching equipment and a failed signal. The decision to delay rescue had not been accidental. Dispatch books had been altered. Death certificates had been falsified. Families had been lied to about when their loved ones died. Silas was not charged with causing the deaths. He had been 15. But he publicly accepted responsibility for withholding records, pressuring witnesses, and using his moral authority to keep the truth buried. He resigned from the church boards, the heating fund, and every community program he controlled. The charities remained open under an independent council and were renamed for the 7 people who died in the tunnel. Abigail also gave a public statement. She admitted staging the disappearance, withholding the weather warning, and preventing Samuel from leaving. She did not ask to be celebrated for exposing the truth. Outside the courthouse, Silas told her, "From this day forward, you do not have to carry my family's secret." Abigail looked toward the mountains. Forgiveness will not come in one night. No. But perhaps tomorrow gives it somewhere to begin. Weeks later, Mason found Caleb sitting on a bench at the restored station platform. Snowmelt dripped from the roof. Mason carried the old military report. He held it out. Caleb did not take it. "Tell me from the beginning," Mason said. Caleb studied him. "This time," Mason continued, "I will not sign anything. I will not explain. I will not interrupt." Caleb sat back. After a long moment, he moved his medical bag aside, leaving room on the bench. Mason sat down. Their friendship did not heal in that hour. 14 years could not be erased by one apology. But Caleb began to speak, and Mason remained. By the following winter, the Brightwater Station had become a community archive, a veterans counseling center, and a gathering place for older residents who had spent too many years believing their stories were burdens. One room trained medical support dogs. Another held the book of unfinished promises. Its final pages were left blank for apologies not yet spoken, friends not yet found, truths still waiting, and promises that still had time. The 9th Polaroid was developed and framed above the long table. Mason sat in the middle. Caleb was beside him. Abigail and Silas occupied opposite ends. Claire, Nora, Samuel, Esther, and Owen sat among them. Harlan lay beneath the table with his head across Mason's boots. On the back, Abigail had written, "The 9th chair was never meant for a judge. It was meant for someone loyal enough to stay until the truth was finished." Morning sunlight entered through the station windows and spread across the dog's black and tan coat. Mason rested one hand on Harlan's head. "Maybe a second chance does not begin when someone forgives us," he said. "Maybe it begins when we stop running from what we need to confess." Harlan closed his eyes and leaned into Mason's boots. For the first time since the storm began, the shepherd no longer watched the road ahead. No one needed him to lead. They had finally learned the way home. Sometimes God's miracles do not arrive with thunder, angels, or a sudden light from heaven. Sometimes they come through an old dog standing faithfully at the door, a friend who finally chooses to listen, or a second chance offered after years of silence. The people of Brightwater learned that night that truth may be painful, but a lie carried too long can become a prison. They also learned that forgiveness does not erase responsibility. It simply gives a wounded heart permission to stop living inside the darkest moment of its past. Perhaps there is an unfinished promise in your own life. Maybe there is someone you need to call, an apology you have delayed, a truth you have been afraid to speak, or a friend you should have gone back to find. Do not wait for another storm. God may already be placing the first step in front of you. Loyalty is not only staying beside someone when the road is easy. Sometimes loyalty means remaining in the room long enough to hear the whole truth. Sometimes faith means trusting that God can still build something beautiful from what we regret most. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who may need hope today. Tell us in the comments, is there an unfinished promise in your life that still deserves a second chance? Please subscribe to Sealed Dog Tales and join us for more stories about courage, faithful dogs, wounded hearts, and the quiet miracles that lead people home. May God protect you, strengthen your family, comfort every lonely heart, and guide you toward the people and promises that still need your love. May He bless you with peace, forgiveness, and the courage to begin again.